He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Hello, hello.
Hello there.
Hi, John. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm very well.
Is this Kim?
Yes, it is. You won't remember I spoke to you a while ago about some far-flung place I can't even remember now.
No, I remember your name. So, yes.
Well, fortunately, I remember yours too. Let me sketch out some kind of intro that I have in my head.
Okay.
You're listening to Kim Hill Wants to Know, and this is, in fact, Kim Hill. In this episode, I speak with Jon Lee Anderson, whose life of adventure began when he was very young.
I was always, plotting how I would overthrow this or that tyrant.
He began writing for The New Yorker in 1998, and he's covered some of the most intractable conflicts and some of the most troubled and chaotic parts of the world: Latin America, Syria, Afghanistan, many more. His several books include a biography of Che Guevara, subtitled A Revolutionary Life. And it was Che Guevara who played a part in John's particular focus on lives devoted to an ideal, on people prepared to die for an ideal. In the introduction to his 1992 book, The Guerrillas, he wrote, "As a 10-year-old boy, I saw the gritty front-page photograph of Che Guevara on his deathbed. From that moment on, I was fascinated by that image of the rebel, the guerrilla."
He wouldn't have become some doctrinaire, intransigent old fart, you know what I mean?
In the process of writing Che Guevara's biography, John discovered where his body was in Bolivia. So, as a 10-year-old boy, you saw this photograph. You clearly were an adventurer yourself.
Well, yes. At the age of 10, I was a wannabe adventurer. My family lived in 9 countries before I was 18, or by the time I was 18. And at the age of 10, we were living in Taiwan, having already lived in Colombia and Korea at that point. And I remember distinctly seeing the picture of Che dead on the cover of what must have been the American overseas or military newspaper, the Stars and Stripes. Although my father wasn't in the military, we would get that paper at our house. And I'd never seen a photograph of a dead contemporary person where the people surrounding the body, in this case, it was the military men who had captured and killed Che. They were looking at him in this famous photograph. They were not mourning him. I mean, it was an unusual photograph. And so I remember being becoming aware at that moment and asking my father who this was and what was happening. And I don't really recall his explanation, but I do remember that he tried to put it into context for me. And that's my earliest memory of Che Guevara.
To those guys who killed him, was he a sort of a gotcha like Osama bin Laden?
Well, I suppose so. But the people that were looking at him were clearly not mourning him. They were examining him clinically. They were looking at him. But there was obviously, he had this air of importance. And so I was aware of Che Guevara from that moment on. So although I wasn't of the generation that, famously the cliche goes that, had his poster on their dorm room wall, I'm, 8 or 10 years younger than those. But as I grew up, he remained very much the sort of patron saint of the rebellious world. After all, this was the 1960s into the 70s. And as I came of age, Che's face, Che's name, Che's memory, the book or two that had survived him, the Bolivian Diary, and also his manual on guerrilla warfare, these were part of the paraphernalia of the revolutionary world and the world that I came of age in, where the establishment, the status quo, was being challenged in a multiplicity of ways. And so he was always there as this figure that I suppose that when I was an adolescent and even into my early 20s, I hadn't really examined him. He was simply there, like for maybe someone in celebrity, growing up in celebrity culture, might have, in the same generation, might have noticed and recognized and acknowledged or even admired, say, Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley, but because they were celebrity icons. And so was Che. He was born in the age of the celebrity icon and the televisual age. And so it wasn't until I was actually working as a reporter, and yes, I was an adventurous youngster. I, spent most of my teens and 20s trying to get to wild places. And by my mid 20s, I was working as a reporter in Central America where there were wars going on. And once again, I came across the figure of Che as a symbol of veneration amongst the left-wing guerrillas I would meet in the mountains. As I became fascinated by this breed of people, women and men, who I was encountering in the mountains of the we used to call it the third world, the developing world, often fighting against the United States and what it represented, I found that there were kindred groups all around the world. We're talking about the 1980s now. I once counted up over 40 groups fighting as insurgencies around the world. And that's what led me to research a book about guerrillas, and for which I traveled around the world nearly 4 years, living with different guerrilla groups of every stripe. And that was how Che emerged as an idea to write the biography of him, because I found that he had transcended his own beliefs, his own culture, and was a figure of generation, not only in El Salvador amongst Marxist guerrillas, let's say, or Nicaragua, but amongst the Afghan Mujahideen, anti-communists, in Burma, in the jungle there, with, if anything, they were also anti-communist animists, and elsewhere. And once I began seeing this, because I was studying guerrillas to find out what made these sort of people tick. What was it that made people from around the world take up the option of possibly killing and dying as a way of life? And one of the, in fact, the only personality that they all had in common was Che Guevara. And this led me to begin to think, well, so what about Che? What do I know about him? And I realized I knew little more than, recognizing his face, and began to delve into what was known about him and the mystery of him, and what had yet to be discovered about him.
You clearly were a rebellious youth. I mean, you've described yourself as a boy who knew no rules, a boy who acknowledged no rules. And I can see the seduction of these idealistic guerrilla groups to you. You write about them in an admiring and an anthropological way. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. Look, I think, okay, it's true. I did have a very strong rebellious streak. I grew up questioning authority because of, I think in part because of the age I grew up in. When I was 11 years old, the first time we lived in the United States, when I was a conscious adult, we left when I was 2. We returned for 10 months and we lived in Washington, D.C. in 1968. In that year, Martin Luther King was assassinated and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated. My parents had taught us, myself and my 4 siblings, to be racially tolerant, and they were huge fans of both Martin Luther King and of Kennedy, as they had been of John F. Kennedy, who had been killed when I was 6, and I distinctly remembered that, as well as a family. It was experienced as a family tragedy. So to come back to the United States for the first time and to experience this horror, this tragedy it wasn't just the killing of Martin Luther King. Then there was rioting across the country. Remember, my father drove me through the streets of Washington, D.C. with, dozens of blocks of the city smoldering. I sold bumper stickers with "I Have a Dream, One America" on it, which was one of the famous aphorisms of Martin Luther King. And neighbors of ours sicked their dogs on me. And it was a real rude awakening. When we left the United States after those 10 months to Indonesia, I really despised the country. I didn't want to return, which set off a whole new series of escapades on my part. I was now 11. My parents left me on a ranch in Australia to try to sort of satisfy my urge to be in the wilderness. We went to Indonesia, where I hoped to do all kinds of wilderness, exploration in Sumatra and Wirian Jaya and so on. And we had to be evacuated because of a medical emergencies and so on. And had to be, when we returned to the United States, I ran away. I ran away repeatedly. I did not want to go back to Washington. I was just 12. My parents made me come with them. But after less than a year of being back in the United States, they realized I was desperately unhappy. And I didn't really recognize my age as a restriction, which was a problem for them. And so they proposed that I go and live with my uncle in Liberia, West Africa, where he was working as a geologist. And so there's a whole story there. But the point is that at a very crucial age, I experienced the United States, my home country, where the good people were being assassinated. And we were also, as a country, involved in what my family regarded as a criminal adventure in Vietnam. And so, although my father was in the Foreign Service, we marched as a family on the White House in anti-war protests when I was 11, 12, 13 years old. So I did not respect the rules or the establishment such as it existed in government form, in law enforcement form, and for that matter, in schools as well. So I was a bit of I was very much attracted to those who were challenging authority and tried to learn about them. And I suppose, yes, that led me on this path that eventually brought me to Che Guevara, who was, in a sense, the ultimate rebel of the era.
I was thinking about you the other day, actually, recently. A celebrity called Kirsty Woolsop has got into the news for allowing her 15-year-old son, then 15-year-old, and his 16-year-old companion to travel Eurostar across Europe, make their own way, organise their own travel. She was very proud. And she got completely dumped on, got into a Twitter storm because people accused her of being negligent, and now social welfare is onto her. And I was thinking about, I don't know how old you were, you ran away at 12, whatever, but when you decided to go and meet up with your sister in Africa, your father gave you $200 in traveller's checks and told you to make it last.
Yeah. Right. So by then I was 17, but prior to that, so after, when I went to live in Liberia at the age of 13, I turned 14 there with my uncle. And my family made me return at the end of that year. But that year I went to East Africa on my own. And, in an arranged trip via my parents and my aunt and uncle, I was supposed to stay with certain families they knew in Kampala, in Uganda, in Nairobi, and in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. But I took off. And I was supposed to go for a month, and I stayed 2 months. So I got, I got lost as far as they were concerned. And I had the time of my life traveling around on my own, lying about my age, and basically getting by, and repeatedly coming across adults who were flummoxed to find me in the middle of, say, walking through the Serengeti desert or here and there, and asking me what I was doing and how old I was. I would invariably lie, and they couldn't really judge my age, although they must have realized I was pretty damn young. But I had extraordinary experiences. And in a way, after that, although I got sort of in trouble with my aunt and uncle, they were all relieved that I reemerged. They brought me back. I was sort of, disciplined. You're not going to be able to do that again. Why didn't you tell us where you were? We were worried sick about you. Well, but I was at least back and safe and sound, So I went from strength to strength. Every time I had one of these experiences, it just fueled me for the next one. That's why after that year in Africa, I came back to the US where my parents were still living. And it was, if anything, I was more rebellious than ever. And they decided to move to England after a year, in part for my sake. And once we were there, I began traveling again. And that's why 2 years on, I tried to meet my sister who was living with a tribe in Togo. And of course I didn't make it and got into even more trouble. But
you ended up living in the Canary Islands in Las Palmas for months, basically on the street. And had to be
on the street, on the
had to be-
ports, on the fishing nets in the port.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So
And
were you
yeah.
always fearless then?
Well, I don't know. It's funny. I don't think I had fear as a child. I just did not have any fear. And if anything, there was the cult of not heroism, but I admired people who did extraordinary things. My mother was a storyteller and a writer of children's books. My father was actually a storyteller and something of an adventurer himself. Although he'd gone into government, when he left high school, he tried to get a ship to Vladivostok and with a friend, and something happened. And so he ended up getting one to somewhere like Papeete or Fiji. And he spent 4 years in the South Pacific adventuring around and happened to be at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked, and then spent another 4 years in the South Pacific at war and didn't go to college until he was 27. And then very quickly went abroad with my mother by then. And so between the two of them, they nurtured this idea of a very imaginative life, of a world that was full of surprise and adventure. And for me, the most important, wilderness that I wanted to explore, like the people I had read about. And it was, if anything, it was a real shock and very depressing for me to discover that the world was shrinking, that the world I'd read about that people, say in the 19th century, had discovered was now disappearing in the face of overpopulation, that there were things like pollution, that animals were going extinct, that the modern life was displacing this world that I was desperate to see for myself. And so parallel to that, I began keeping lists from the age of about, I guess, 6 or 7 of the things I wanted to do. And in a sense, it was my own coming of age list. And I would adjust these and add to them over the years. But I had a list of things that I felt I had to do for my personal education and to become a man, And they included things like go to war, go to prison, climb mountains, cross the seas, be a sailor, be a coal miner, many, many things. And so as I grew up as a child and then as an adolescent and even as a young man, I was still ticking things off this list. For me, they were essential ingredients to what I regarded as my personal atlas for becoming a person, before becoming a man, whatever anybody thought or however impractical it was. And I began trying to do these things from the time I was very, very young. I mean, even when we were still living in Taiwan, I guess I was about 9 at the time. This is pre-Tiger Taiwan. This is jungle Taiwan. My father allowed me to go down island to the very sort of, wilder part of Taiwan with a Chinese employee of his who took me around for a week. And we went hunting and fishing and doing all kinds of things. And I loved that. And so my parents, of course, thinking each of these things were, okay, well, he'll be satisfied now. Well, no, all that did was sharpen my teeth for more. And it just kept going. It became, inexhaustible to the point where...
Do you think your parents thought you were a nightmare, or do you think they were incredibly proud of you?
I think it was a mix. My mother, I never recall my mother or my father actually reprimanding me for that kind of thing. I don't recall it. Maybe they did, but I think instead they were aware they had a real challenge on their hands, because as I said earlier, I don't think I had any fear. You learn fear, or I learned fear later. You learn to be afraid because you have to survive situations, and therefore you have a fear response, But in those, I went through all of Africa, I would go to the bush in Liberia. I was never happier as a child than those times when I was in the bush on my own, or amongst Africans in the middle of the bush, hours and hours from anywhere by foot. And they accepted me on the terms of my arrival. That is, just as this boy who came. And I was never in any danger from them. And so, I guess I began to experience what danger was on a different scale a little bit older, as I would say, in some of my rovings, would bump into criminals or maybe the first times I went to war. But I did not have fear before that. And so what I remembered was that when my mother encouraged me to write always and to record what I was experiencing and to give me a sense of purpose that was more than just being an adventurer, experiential, and trying to channel me towards literary figures in some cases who might inspire me or be my mentor. I remember her introducing me to Gerald Durrell, to Graham Greene, to George Orwell, to Joseph Conrad. My father, I think, was proud of me, although he had to be privately worried. I don't recall him actually telling me off for these things. I think I was a sort of chip off the old block. And it wasn't until I started getting in trouble sort of, with the law, so to speak, when we were back in the States or in places like that, where it was an actual problem because I was up to no good, being wild, breaking the law, all that stuff.
Taking the drugs.
Drugs, hanging out with bad guys, and I think they were worried then because, I could have easily gone on to sort of rob banks, which seemed like a pretty romantic thing to do to me as well.
Well, sure. I mean, depending on where you were going to put the money, you could have funded those Burmese guerrillas.
Exactly. Well, one of the first, actually, when I was about 11, because my parents had lived in Haiti before I was born, and my eldest sister, Michelle Dominique, French name, was born in Haiti. And I grew up on the stories of Haiti and what had happened to Haiti since they left it. Papa Doc Duvalier had taken over, tormented a lot of the people they knew, killed some of them. Others had fled into exile. And there were photographs of Haiti. And my parents had loved Haiti. And so I began to, when I was around, I guess, 11 or 12, I began to, I pored over the Atlas. I love the Atlas, the World Atlas. And I began to plot a coup in Haiti. This really got into high gear when Papa Doc died and handed off to his 19-year-old son, Baby Doc. And I began plotting a coup, and I developed this whole plan of how I would overthrow this dictatorship. And it involved mercenaries. I remember. I had a pretty good plan, I thought. I've always been a fairly, critical judge of coups in the years since then, because I think I developed a pretty good plan for Haiti at that point. Later on, I moved to other countries and was always, plotting how I would overthrow this or that tyrant.
On this bucket list that you mentioned, I don't know what you call it when you do it when you're very young, but the equivalent of the bucket list, go to war. Well, you've obviously been to war. Go to prison. Did you ever go to prison?
I did. I've been to prison several times, but twice. Once as a prison guard. I worked as a prison guard one summer, and I went to prison for 2 years in Peru once.
A whole 2 years?
I have seen prison from both sides of the bars, yeah. That's definitely, on that category, I would say I have a PhD in penitentiary sciences.
Can you tell me a little more about being in a Peruvian prison for 2 years, please?
Sure. Well, it's not something I've really written about yet, so I just haven't stopped and had the time, really. But I was just beginning my life as a reporter. I'd worked for a year in Peru as a sort of cub reporter. And amongst other things, I reported on the plight of foreigners who were caught in Peru's prisons, most of them for drugs. And I also did a trip along the Amazon, which was the kind of early cocaine trail. And I was, how shall I put this? I was then arrested and imprisoned and accused of drug trafficking and arms possession myself. And at a time when it was still the military dictatorship, they had abolished the Ministry of Justice. Democracy was returning. There was an election right around the time I was arrested, but it took a while to kick into gear. And so I was sent to a prison, which, was built for 1,500 and now held 10,000, and was a very violent place. And I was facing a 15 to 25 year prison sentence. But I got out after just under 2 years. I was absolved and had to leave the country. And my nemesis for this whole experience were the now outlawed PIP, Peruvian Investigative Police. They were the secret police, and they were heavily involved in the drug trade themselves. So this was something I brought up at trial, and I didn't earn myself any friends in that regard. And so it was a pretty dramatic experience for a very young reporter. I had to get out of the country. I had to leave the country. And that's when I left prison at the age of 25, I felt, well, okay, I've experienced quite a bit, but I haven't experienced war. And so the first thing I did when I got out was try to get to war. It was the last thing on my list. And within 10 or 11 months of leaving prison, I was in Central America experiencing war and working as a young reporter there. And that began my career as a journalist, really. It had been truncated by the Peruvian experience. But it was an incredible learning curve being in prison amongst criminals, because you have to survive. Nothing terrible happened to me, by the way. If anything, I was a bit like, I don't know if you remember that old James Clavell novel, Lord Jim.
Yes.
Yeah, I came out like Lord Jim. I was fine. I had a girlfriend who brought me food twice a week. Most men are abandoned after 6 months by their wives or girlfriends. She kept coming. There was a lot of violence, but I had to figure out how to defend myself. I got very involved in politics in the prison. I became the chief of my wing. One of my more dramatic experiences was being taken in chains for a televised dialogue between the gang leaders of the prison. And I was the 15th leader, so to speak, of a wing, but I was the only one who didn't have a gang, right? And in the presidential palace, we had a roundtable with the Ministry of Justice. And I was involved in all kinds of, efforts to get the laws implemented in prison, because they had essentially thrown away the key for a lot of people. People were in prison up to 2-3 years after their time, their sentences. It was pretty intense.
Why did they let you out?
Well, I had pretty high level support.
Right.
Assistant Secretary of State came down and tried to get me out. Everybody agreed to let me go, with the exception of the prosecutor, who asked for help getting his daughter into a certain private school in Virginia. Thank you very much. Whereupon, that was refused, and I stayed in prison rather. But it did, I think, help me get to trial. So I got to trial after a year and a half. There were guys in there. I knew one guy who'd been in jail for 9 years and never got into trial. They simply, they had no clout. But it was at least usually 2 to 3 years. So I got to trial. I went to trial 14 times, and I was absolved. But it was intense, and it was touch and go. And then I had to be escorted to a plane by the U.S. Embassy, because they were worried that those secret police would abduct me on the tarmac. Because I made it very plain what I thought of them and what I thought they were up to. Indeed, I think it was the next president abolished that force.
Good Lord. I mean, if you wrote a complete story of your life, nobody would believe it, of course. And I need to remind people that as we speak, you are in possibly the place that is opposite to your whole life, which is Dorset in England. Huh?
That's right. Well, Dorset has been a fallback sort of second home to me since I was 15. When my parents decided to come to England, we lived in a little picturesque Dorset town on what is now called the Jurassic Coast, called Lyme Regis.
Ah, the French lieutenant's woman. You would have shaken
Yes,
Lyme
exactly.
Regis up a bit, wouldn't you?
I sure did. Yeah, I sure
I
did.
did.
Yeah, I got kicked out of school there. But- and then I spent another year in Exeter, a Devon town nearby. But it was also the last place my family were together as a family. My parents, in fact, broke up after that. And so over the years, I stayed in touch with the girl who was sort of she was my sweetheart. And we saw each other, 4 years later, and then another 4 years in our 20s. And after the whole Peruvian thing and a bit of war, I came looking for her in England, and we married and have a family. So she was by then in London, we were then in Oxford, but then went off to Cuba and Spain. And around 2001, when around the time of 9/11, we had our children were quite small. We'd been between Cuba and Spain, we'd been 10 years in Latin countries. And my parents had died. We only had one grandparent left. She was living back in Dorset. That was my wife's mother in Bridport, which is near Lyme Regis. And so we decided to go there for an experimental year because the kids were speaking Spanglish. I wanted them to have a feeling of a sense of place, not to be completely expats, And this place had some meaning because it was where we'd met. They had been to see their gran a few times. It was my family had lived there. It's a sort of nice corner of Britain. And we could remain close enough to Spain where they could keep their Spanish. So, and that's what we did. Do
you want your children, I mean, I don't know how old they are, but do you want them to be as fearless and adventurous as you? Are they?
They sort of are. I mean, each of them are quite different, but I've two girls and a boy. They're in their 30s now. And yes, they're very adventurous. One of my daughters went off to Siberia in Russia. And that's a whole story there. And she speaks Russian and is an adventurer. And my son went off to the Amazon. And he sort of followed in my footsteps. He did some stuff with guerrillas in Colombia. He's sort of wants to be a storyteller, is making his first inroads in the media. And another daughter, middle one, took herself off which is adventurous in its own right. She's the first and the only one really to go off and live on her own in the United States, first California, now New England. But, and they're all very tied to Dorset and to the Latin world. They're all trilingual now. They speak Spanish just as well as they do English. They have strong feelings for the Latin cultures they were acculturated in. They feel comfortable in Britain, which I wanted them to feel because, as you may know, if you're from the Antipodes, that, the Brits aren't so easy. Unless you go there as a child or go to school there, you're never fully accepted. So I'm their Yankee dad, but they feel completely comfortable there. I also eventually got them all their US passports, so they are legally American as well. And of course, it's pretty easy to, at least outside of the Trumpian era, to feel comfortable as an outsider in the United States. So I've achieved something that I don't think I had as a child, which was a sense of place for them that came from at least one of our two birth countries, I never will feel entirely at home in the US, although I'm from there.
No.
I'll never feel entirely at home in England, but I like it where we are.
It's clear to me that you, I don't know whether you still are, but you were a romantic. And that, I mean, idealism, yes, romanticism, yes. And I was drawn, you don't talk about yourself very much in your books, but I was drawn to this passage in your book Gorillas. And you're talking about the Karen guerrillas in Burma. And you're talking about how 19th century their idealistic volunteerism is. And you mentioned the 19th century before. The purity of vision possessed by its people gives Burma a Shangri-La quality. It contrasts starkly with the degraded political culture immediately across the border in Thailand, with its rampantly consumerist society in which everything is for sale at the right price. Little idealism is in evidence in Thailand. That country's own communist insurgency dried up a few years ago, and you were writing this in the late 80s, early 90s, dried up a few years ago when the few remaining fighters were amnestied and bought off with bank loans and farmland. I mean, that's a very depressing picture. I wondered whether you have lost your romanticism now.
That's a very good question, and you picked up on a very telling passage. I'd forgotten I'd written that, but yes, definitely the way I felt and would, I think, still feel. Look, I would say that I haven't. It's easy to become a cynic if you've been to a lot of conflicts, as I have,
Sure.
or observed politics closely, as I have. And I suppose there are places where I feel more cynical than others. But I don't feel that I am a cynic as such. I have a sardonic, maybe even sarcastic sense of humor, and that's maybe how I channel it. But I try not to be cynical in my writing and my thinking. If anything, at the moment, I would say I'm in search. It's maybe an intellectual or maybe historical search for what happened to idealism in the world we live in today. And I think we could have long conversations about that, social media, the internet, blah, 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 everything's Googleable. The idea of the mystery of the original world it seems to have gone or is going. But I have been through this several times before. Like, I think I told you that when I was a child, and I'll never forget it. I was 11. We were in Indonesia. A Life magazine came when it was still Life magazine, and there was a huge pictorial spread on the endangered wildlife of the world. And it was a shock to me. It was a deep shock that that world that I'd idealized as it had been was going. And so I've been aware of that ever since. And then I remember another time, maybe 10 years later, when I was in my mid-20s, and I made my first early 20s, my first 20 actually, my first trips into the Amazon. And I remember the pang of disappointment I felt when I saw my first indigenous, deep in the bush, wearing a t-shirt, indigenous person wearing a t-shirt. And then I realized, with more, it wasn't like they all had t-shirts. There were still people that we now call uncontacted. And I ran into some of these people. And I had extraordinary experiences, which you can still have. They're fleeting now. And it's rarer, but it's there. And I began to realize in my mid-20s, and it's sort of in the book too, the Gorillas book, that it's not what you wear. It's not on the superficie. The world seems to have been explored and it's over. But in fact, it's what's in people's minds and hearts and souls that is the true tierra incognita. The true unexplored realm of the world lies within us. And this was something that I had very present as I went around the world and lived with these different cultural groups that had taken up arms, and discovered that in some ways, their minds were in another century, in some cases, many centuries before the one I lived within. And I think that's still the case. And of course, we've seen this kind of cultural collision in the last 20, 30 years with, irredentist Islam, efforts to return the world back to a caliphate, idealized caliphate. That's its own sort of, let's call it toxic romanticism, right? But there are also places where people, despite even now, despite internet, despite Google, despite Twitter, or whatever it is, there are people who inhabit a different time and space. And realizing that is somehow, I don't know that it's reassuring, but it reaffirms something I feel I discovered over a quarter century ago. And that is that the world is still to be explored. It's still to be explored. And, we may cover up the original world with roads and cars or whatever, but actually it's what's in people's minds that tells the true story about I think about the reality in which we live.
You're familiar, of course, with the death of idealistic movements. I mean, we're familiar with what happened in Nicaragua. If Che Guevara, for example, if Che Guevara had lived, would he have lived to a successful old age, or do we revere him because he died young?
I think, of course, we revere him because he died young. He died also heroically. And that is something the world over that is recognized and acknowledged. And that's one of the reasons I found him so fascinating, because I found people who were anti-communist who revered and admired Che Guevara as the ultimate guerrilla, the ultimate revolutionary, because he had managed to live and die according to the maximum expression of those ideals, which is to say, it's worth dying for an ideal. So he became the maximum expression of sort of, you could call it armed idealism. Now, if he had lived, Che would have probably he was a very intelligent guy. I would like to think he would have continued to have evolved politically, and that he wouldn't have become some doctrinaire, intransigent old fart. You know what I mean? Can I say that? A doctrinaire old Marxist who just, swung into gear and saluted every time Fidel or anybody else who claimed they were a Marxist said something. I would like to think that he today would sit in judgment of the new thugocracy that has emerged from the embers of revolutionary leftism in Latin America, Nicolas Maduro, Daniel Ortega, and even, the kind of gray regime that's now in Cuba. These are demagogic authoritarians who are, in some cases, out and out thieves as well.
So is there a revolution?
Today.
Is there a revolution? Has there been a guerrilla movement that you would describe as a success? Or is it all part of the, endless evolution?
It's really interesting you asked that, because this is very possibly is the grist for a book I hope to take a sabbatical and write as a kind of sequel to my Che Guevara biography. At one time, I thought I would write a biography of Fidel Castro, but with the passing of the years and his death and what's happened to the left and the idea of revolution in the world, especially in Latin America, and having gotten to know a lot of those who have been or were revolutionaries, including some of the leaders of the FARC, the Colombian revolutionary movement, who also became drug traffickers.
Sure.
I believe that there is something to be said and explored about, what happened to revolution. Is the revolutionary arc of history that, at least for the West, began, let's say, with the French Revolution in the 1780s, did it die out with Fidel's death? What is there now? What is there today? There is not. These are not real revolutionary movements. The new revolutionaries, in fact, are reactionaries. The two most commented on leaders in Latin America are far to the right. One is Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, who has had the pleasure of locking up 2% of his population and securing the country's streets, and therefore is commented about because he did this revolutionary thing in crime solving and dispensing with, with the rule of law, but nonetheless being effective. And lately, Javier Milei, the so-called, the self-described anarcho-capitalist of Argentina. These are the most commented on and apparently admired and dynamic leaders in the region today. What do people say about Ortega, Maduro, or for that matter, Diaz-Canel, who most people don't even know his name, the new guy in Cuba? There are no youngsters wearing Che Guevara t-shirts beating down the door to go and live in Cuba today, or for that matter, Nicaragua, to be a Sandinista, or a Sandinista. or for that matter, to join the so-called Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. No, everybody knows it's not a revolution. It's a corrupt oil state with military in charge. So what's fascinating is the way storytelling and image making and what was the old saying that came up in the 60s? The medium is the message. More now than ever. It's fascinating the way the so-called progressive left, because Putin is against, let's say, what the United States does or supports Maduro, they support Putin. And Putin himself repudiates communism. And what is he? He represents the security state. Everything that is anti-democratic in the world is what is exemplified by Vladimir Putin and those who follow him. So I think the idea of Marxist, particularly Marxist revolutionary idealism, has been perverted and has transmuted into what we see today.
Wasn't it former Chilean President Pinochet, of course, who told you that, I don't know whether it was him, who said if people had to vote between authoritarianism and stability or, socialism and democracy, they'd vote for authoritarianism and stability?
It was actually Daniel Noboa, the current president of Ecuador, whom I spent time in the spring.
Well, he's an interesting guy, right? I mean, he's got this narco state was not present when you were concentrating back in the day, and it leaps borders. And he's having to deal with Colombia and the drug cartels coming over. What else do you do except line up the army and become brutal?
Yeah. And what you just pointed out is it's a key case in point. 60 years ago, when Che was alive, there was no narco culture. Some jazz guys in Chicago snorted coke and a few hippies smoked pot. And in Latin America, it was similar. There were tiny elites that smoked pot or did a little coke or whatever. Nowadays, it's a vast multinational industry which has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, produces billions and billions of dollars in income for people, and has punched the holes through the rule of law the world over. And this, I think, has also created a new economy and a new economic strain to what we would call capitalism. So again, going back 60 years, if you were the son of a coffee laborer or a sugar plantation laborer in El Salvador or Brazil or wherever, and your parents earned $1 a day, well, that was what you would have earned too. Now you can be part of that underclass and get rich quick, because the rural, the large, much has happened elsewhere in Europe, for instance. The countryside is emptied out. People have gone to the cities. They live in slums, right? The new Latin America is in the slums. And the criminal gangs and cartels control these places, and not just those places, but that underground, what used to be an underground economy, what we call the narco economy, is now includes people trafficking or whatever, gold, all the boom or bust sort of economies, which are hugely destructive, but also offer the possibility of getting rich quick. Those recourses simply did not exist to the poor a half a century ago, and now they do. And that's killed off the idea of romantic idealism. Who's going to go to a hilltop with an AK-47 and fight for a better tomorrow? No. You want your motorbike and your gold chain and your girlfriend on the back of it today, right? You're still going to live fast and die young, but you're going to do it on your own terms, and you're going to do it violently, and that's what's happening.
And so when you...
Narco-culture has erased revolutionary idealism.
Yeah. So when you interviewed Pinochet, I mean, you described him as a successful former dictator, a very rare thing, a successful former dictator. And
yes,
whatever you say about Pinochet, and one can say a lot, of course, he transformed society, he created a strong economy, and if that's what it takes to inoculate against those predatory drug cartels, then hooray, build a statue to him, huh?
Except he didn't make Chile safe from drug cartels. He did not. He did not inoculate his population from the evils of a borderless world. You know, Pinochet had his day essentially in the pre-globalized world, and he turned out to be corrupt himself. It's one of those ironies that the conservative, you know, bedrock population of Chile that looked the other way while he was disappearing people were finally shocked and ashamed when it turned out he had 26 bank accounts abroad. And that's what truly brought him down, right? And into disgrace. Nowadays, the people that live in Chile's slums are now part of the flourishing borderless narco culture and narco economy increasingly that extends everywhere from Venezuela's prisons, you know, into the slums of Santiago. It's a real problem. And the new leaders, and if I know the new leader of Chile, he's a social democrat, really, Gabriel Boric, very young, idealistic, and simply does not know how to enforce the law in a way that would be effective vis-a-vis the gang violence and the creeping, you know, in some cases caused by migrants, you know, from a collapsed society. Speaking of Venezuela here, not only, but a lot of it is, in fact, ignited by this moving sea of humanity who is trying to survive it by whatever means possible, and is crossing the borders everywhere they go. There are these crime vectors that go with them. And it's not to blame the migrant population so much as it is the reality of the globalized economy, which doesn't recognize borders and seeks a bit like Alien, the Alien movies, you know, energy and moves into a vacuum. So wherever there is a vacuum, you know, it fills it. So yes, you could say that, I mean, who is the new Pinochet? Well, I guess it would be Bukele, according to the formula the scenario you described. And of course, people are applauding him, especially people in countries where they don't have control over the gangs and the homicide rates are high. And it's very high in Latin America. In fact, it's the region with the highest homicide rates in the world. And one of the reasons for that is the narco economy and the fact that they are democracies now. So it's very appealing to the spectrum. Let's bring back an iron hand and let's waste the criminals and let's do this, let's do that. But what we're seeing is, you know, typically huge transgressions being performed in the name of law enforcement by in some cases, extremely corrupt police forces entrusted with, you know, clearing the streets. Something like happened in Duterte's Philippines. Typically, I mean, if it was the Norwegians doing it, maybe, you know, maybe we could see an iron hand applied to organized crime without human rights violated. But it's just one more of these. I believe it's just one more of these areas in which modern society doesn't have the adequate answers yet. And as a result, these problems are becoming the grist for the new authoritarian populists. And the humanistic Democrats who want to adhere to rule of law and to see a more humanistic society emerge from the present time are really against the ropes. And this period is posing serious new challenges for all of us.
Well, everything is feeling a little depressing now. You've got your narco states, you've got your failed states. It's very hard to imagine how the dial can be turned back. Things feel out of control.
They do, but I think we all feel, and I include myself here, a surge of hope. Not to say idealism, but hope. And going back to what has been a central tenet of our conversation, Kim, this idea of idealism and hope. I think the more I've seen the dark side in the world, the more I have come to believe that, and this may sound a little trite, but that you have to, I've even had to kind of remind myself to look for means of hope and forward motion and, a path forward for readers, for people listening to me or whatever it is, so that especially young people can believe that there is a future, can believe that they have a place in making that happen, rather than this kind of fatalistic response that a lot of us do have in the face of dark news, where we switch off, we tune out, we just watch Netflix movies, we take drugs, we drink, we I don't know what we do. You know what I mean? We live individual consumerist lives. We become polyamorous. I don't know. You know what I mean? or do we still think, and is idealism not just a chimera, not just a silly illusion, but something that can be channeled and given muscle tissue to fight forward and bring society forward? I would hope that it's the latter. Even if it is an idea we've just plucked out of, the ether, I still do think that is something that's an extraordinarily powerful ingredient and part of our kind of spiritual or alchemical makeup, our psyche. And that at times it can produce extraordinary things. It can also produce incredibly toxic things.
Traditional format would suggest that we end this interview with that kind of clarion call. However, I want to go back to where we started, and I want you to describe to me how you came to discover where Che Guevara's body was in Bolivia.
Sure thing. I had been researching, investigating Che's life and death for the previous 5 years. I'd been living in Cuba. I was on a trip to Bolivia. I had spent 2 months in Bolivia talking to just about everybody I could that had anything to do with him, guerrilla survivors. I had interviewed the former head of the Communist Party who was living in exile in Moscow, who seemed to have betrayed Che. I had even interviewed the CIA agent who had given the order to kill Che in Miami. And I had talked to the man who'd actually pulled the trigger protected by the military, living in hiding 28 years later. And I had tracked down a general who had been part of the counterinsurgency effort against Che Guevara's campaign. And I remember I was exhausted. It was September or so, 95. I almost canceled the interview because I was so tired. I'd also previously been in Argentina. So I'd been on the road for 2 months. My family was waiting for me back in Cuba. And I almost canceled it, but decided I would go ahead and see this man. Now, why would I have canceled it? Because he didn't, as far as I knew, come into any direct contact with Che. He was famous because, in a local way, because he had wiped out half of Che's guerrilla column about 6 weeks before Che himself was apprehended and then executed. And, his army unit had ambushed half of Che's guerrillas as they crossed the river. And it included, amongst the victims were Tanya, the Argentine East German guerrilla, famous Tanya la Guerrillera. And so this guy had written a kind of self-serving book, locally published. Anyway, I decided, okay, I'll go along and see him. And I went to his farm. He had a farm on the outskirts of the town. And he had a woman who brought us coffee repeating. He was in his early 50s. He had retired. He was very open. I asked him, I was kind of just plowing through, not really sure what I was hoping to get. And then I remembered that one of the guerrillas that had died in this adventure at his hands, or his army's hands, the story was that he'd been executed, not just killed in the ambush. And his sister, I had spoken to his sister, and his sister asked me to try to find out what had happened to her brother. So I asked this general, Mario Vargas Salinas was his name, what happened to this guerrilla, Freddy Maimuda? And he paused, and then he said, we executed him. And he explained why. And he said that there had been 2 survivors of the 10, I think, that died in the river. One was cowardly and was clutching his legs, begging him for his life. And the other was defiant and arrogant. And his men were angry because they had lost a couple of fellow soldiers in previous days. And he told them to take out the arrogant one, and he pardoned the life of the one who was hugging his knees. And he used him as a spy. He used him as an informer. He flipped him. And he was very open about this. It was very brutal. And I thought, wow, he's really being honest. And I tried to think of what else I could ask him about. And I ran out of ideas, switched off my recorder, which was between us on the table, stood up. And just then I thought, wait a minute. He told me he was in Valle Grande, the town where Che's body was displayed after he was executed and then disappeared. He was there that night. He was there. So he must know where Che's body was. And so I turned back on still standing, we both stood up, turned on my tape recorder, and I said, what happened to Che? Where is his body? And he looked at me again and he said, I've been wanting to talk to you about that. He's buried under the airstrip in Valle Grande. And then he proceeded to tell me that night, the night he had been displayed, the photographs of his dead body, and the one I had seen when I was 10, after that, they decided, the Bolivian dictator and they decided they would disappear Che and his fellow comrades they had executed or died in battle, and they would bury them to deny his followers a place to pay him homage. And in fact, Che's brother was traveling from Argentina, was going to arrive the next day to identify his remains. If that happened, the communists would have an iconic figure to venerate. And they decided they would bury him. They took a bulldozer. They went out to the dirt airstrip on the edge of town. They dug a deep trench and they threw the bodies in it. And they covered it back up. And the other guerrillas, there was about 30 in all, were disseminated in different places around this area, in riverbeds and so on. So I asked him why he was telling me. And he said, well, it's been 28 years. The Israelis and the Palestinians, believe it or not, he actually said that, can make peace. Why can't we? This was on the heels of Oslo. What a different world it was.
Sure.
And so I published it. I called to contact the New York Times. I published it front page. It hit like a bombshell, because as it turned out, there was a military secret. So the general that spoke to me fled and issued a denial by fax about the story. I then held a press conference in La Paz, the capital, saying that and the denial felt like it had been dictated to him. And I tried to help him by saying, I think the general I spoke to, seemed to be an honorable Bolivian soldier, a patriot, and wanted to put an end to this sordid history. I believe that other hands have dictated this denial. The president of the country then held a press conference where he said that he heard from the military that I had gotten the general drunk. And, he was trying to impugn my reputation. I then held another press conference in which I produced the tape of the interview from my sock, kind of with drama, and said, it's recorded. I did not get the general drunk. He was an honorable man, and we had coffee. And at that point, the general, wherever he was, sent another fax admitting that what I'd said was true. And the president signed a decree ending the military secrecy regarding Che Guevara and the whereabouts of him and his comrades, and formed a commission to go search for the bodies. And then I joined this search. It's a whole story. It lasts about a year and a half. But the generals tried to squelch the search. They were very angry. Some of them had fought against Che when they were young. Bolivian soldiers that had fought too and never gotten a pension were coming after me. But the government stood firm, and we discovered some bodies, not Che's, which revived the investigation. I managed to get Cuban forensic specialists there, as well as Argentine and Italian. But it took another year and a half. The general that spoke to me was put under house arrest, and he remained mute for the next 5 years. And so, but anyway, a year and a half later, in fact, while I was promoting my book, it had just come out, the Che book, I was given a call that the team that was still working in this area, trying to figure out where on the airstrip it was, called me and they said, we have him, come. And I came. And I was the first person outside of the team to see his remains. And there he was, about 5 meters from the last hole that had been dug a year and a half before. And there was his body. He had an olive green field jacket over his head. You couldn't see his head. One hand with rigor mortis stuck into the air, the hand amputated, because of course they took his hands to keep them in the Argentine police. It's a whole story. And they had found plaster of Paris in his pocket, which had been from the death mask that was taken before they dumped him. And they found tobacco, and they checked his dental records, and it was him. The other bodies, the other 5, I believe, that were next to him were just dumped kind of promiscuously, but he had been laid out with some respect. Anyway, and I was able to then report that he had been found. And there was a whole operation to get the body out of Bolivia back to Cuba in time for the 30th anniversary of his death, and that was successful. But there was a lot of people trying to deny that this was really Che, including one of the CIA agents who had been on the scene, who began spinning a whole story, contacted me and began spinning a whole story that it wasn't really Che, blah, blah, blah. And that persists in certain circles to this day. But it was out of, I think, pique that, Fidel was going to get a party out of it and to be able to commemorate Che and, So that was pretty dramatic. And I felt it was an extraordinary experience that I realized, it went beyond politics. I knew the family. I knew the widow. I'd been working closely with her. This was, after all, a father and a son and a brother and a husband. And I knew the family, and not only of him, but of others there. And so it became a flashpoint, not just for Che and his guerrillas, but for all that disappeared in Bolivia. And people that had been murdered, tortured, and their bodies thrown away years before all over the place began to be uncovered as their relatives began to demand, their whereabouts, their return. And it was very cathartic for Bolivians. And for me, in a way, it made me feel part of a history to, somehow. I never expected to live this kind of postscript to Che's life, but I did. And it was very moving.
Extraordinary. The more you speak, the more I want to say, tell me more, and we haven't run out of things to talk about, but it is possible we never would. So, Jon Lee Anderson, thank you so much.
Anytime, Kim. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Kim Hill Wants to Know, hosted by me, Kim Hill. Kim Hill Wants to Know is produced by Melanie Phipps, with help from Liz Garton and Brianna Uratich-Gregg. Graphics were designed by Robert Whittaker, and the original theme music was composed by the Phoenix Foundation. Particular thanks to RNZ's audio engineers, who've made everything sound, beautiful. Follow and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app so you don't miss an episode, or to get every episode delivered free to your phone. Listen out for my conversation with Ingrid Robins about limitarianism.